So welcome to EM service. We are glad you are here. Turn to your neighbor and say, I'm super glad you are here. Ready? Begin. I'm super glad you are here. Now, if we can all stand, we're going to start our last message of this section, this volume, Creation and Covenant. Today's message title is Blessed Be the Name that we'll see from out of the book of Job. If we can have the slides in the back as well. Okay, so blessed be the name, the book of Job. We're going to read our slides. We have 5 slides together, so we're going to do every other. First is Yugal, then me, and back and forth, okay? Last one all together. Okay, ready? Can we all stand? All of us? Okay? All of us? All of us? Okay. Are you guys ready? We're going to read this out loud. Ready? Job 1, verse 8. Ready? Begin. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Next slide. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Ready to begin? All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. Another messenger arrived with the news. Your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly, a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness and hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Last passage altogether. Ready to begin? Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So one of my core memories, I have a couple core memories with my dad. So if you haven't met my dad, he's great. He's going to be watching this one day soon, probably a couple days, okay? My dad's pretty awesome. He's not perfect, but he's pretty great. I have a couple of core memories with my dad that I still remember distinctly as an adult from when I was young. And one of these core memories, I was in middle school. I think I was like probably 12 years old. And we're sitting in the dentist's office in the waiting room for the dentist, which, I don't know, just so you guys know, I have really weak teeth, and so I get cavities like crazy. So I hated going to the dentist. And I hated going because every time, no matter how well I brush my teeth or floss, I had a cavity. And so we're waiting in the waiting room dentist, and I hate the dentist. And my dad is reading this like parenting book, because back in the day, you did not get parenting advice from Instagram. You got parenting advice from actual books. So he was reading a parenting book, and he was like sitting there reading this book, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my dad goes, Stacy, I just read one of the most important things that will change your life. And I'm 12, and I'm like, okay, Dad. He's like, no, this will change your life. If you really understand this concept, then you will live a good life. And I'm like, okay. And he goes, do you want to know what it is? I was like, well, you're just going to tell me anyway. He's like, you're right. But this is the secret to life. He showed me the book, and he was like, read this. And in all caps, this is what it said. No pain, no gain. And I still remember being 12 and being like, okay, Dad, cool. But he was like, went on this whole spiel, this whole philosophic spiel about like, without pain, there's no gain. Without suffering, there's no growth. If you embrace suffering in your life, you will grow all these things. And I was like, okay, Dad. But it turns out he was right. And it turns out that moment was significant enough to me as a child that I still remember that moment. I can still like picture the dentist office. I can like picture all of that. No pain, no gain. Now, in our last message for this verse volume, we just wrapped up Genesis, and we're actually skipping to the middle of the Bible to a book named Job. It's spelled like Job, but his name is Job, okay? And Job lived around the same time as Abraham-ish. They did not know each other. He was not Hebrew. He lived in a different place than Abraham did. But somehow Job knew God. And through today's message and passage, we're going to hit one of the most important questions that we wrestle with as human beings. If you are human, if you are breathing, you will be asking yourself this question at least once in your life. And that question goes like this: why do we suffer? As Christians, as believers, why do we suffer? Does this mean that God is not powerful? Does this mean that God is not with me? Now, throughout Scripture, we see 3 different reasons why suffering usually happens, okay? So here's one of the reasons that we see in Scripture. Christians can sometimes face suffering as God's discipline for misbehavior. We see that all throughout Scripture, that God uses discipline to stop people from doing worse than what they've been doing, right? If you see parents nowadays, some of you guys see parents nowadays, and they do not discipline their kids, period, at all, okay? If you're a teacher, you've witnessed that in the classroom, right? But with that comes actually a whole set of other issues. If you are not disciplined, now disciplined well, right? Not harshly or out of anger, but discipline, the root of discipline means to teach. And so when we teach children to do the right thing and to not, smack your other person in the face or whatever it is, we're teaching them to go the right path, right? If you are a good parent, you will discipline your kids accordingly. You have to. As a parent, that is your job. That is your role. As teachers, they have a certain role with that, right? If they catch you cheating, they can't just let you go. There are consequences to your behavior, and you have to learn that. If you break the law, you kill somebody, you have to go to jail, right? Like, there are consequences for actions, because without that, it's anarchy in our world, without rule, order, consequences. So as Christians, we sometimes face suffering because God is disciplining us, and he does that because he loves you. Now, second reason why, but that's not the only reason why. The second reason why Christians can sometimes face suffering is as training for spiritual maturity. Because no pain, no gain. Without muscle, you have to work out your muscles out to gain muscle, right? There is a pain process associated with that. But without stretching, without suffering, we actually cannot be trained to be mature spiritually. And when you have a great calling before God to do these great things, you better believe that God also has a great training prepared for you, right? Can anyone just become president? Is that a bad example? Can anyone just become, can anyone just become a teacher? Can anyone just become a counselor? Can anyone just become a pastor? People who lead people in significant ways. Okay? If you talk to a teacher, a counselor, or a pastor, they will tell you that it takes a lot of training and a lot of work to get to where you are. Often not paid well. However, a lot of training required to do this job. I just can't let some person on the street into a classroom to teach. I can't do that. They got to go through a background check. They got to be trained. There are all these things you have to do. If you have a great calling before God, you better believe that God is going to have a great training program ready for you, okay? And some of that will require some suffering, because in that, you will grow. The third reason why Christians experience suffering is that it is often an opportunity to glorify God. There's a story in the book of John 11, I think, where there's a man who was born blind. And everyone at that time used to think if you're born blind or born with some disability, that's because your parents sinned or you sinned. That's what they used to think. And so they asked Jesus, did this man sin or did his parents sin that he was born blind? And Jesus responds, nobody sinned to make this happen. This happened so that one day I could come and heal him, and through that, all of you would see that I'm the Messiah. And so we don't always often understand why God allows suffering. The thing is, in our lives, when we face suffering, we have to discern, is this discipline? Is this training? Is this God doing something that I can't explain? If we understand that, we can catch a better idea of why God allows certain things. But even still, sometimes we may never understand why God allows certain things. We may never understand all of the why behind the suffering. And the perfect story to illustrate that is Job. So some context. The author of Job is unknown. We don't know him, but this was written, Job lived around the time of Abraham, and he worshiped God, okay? If there's any book in the Bible that illustrates suffering well, it is the book of Job. Okay, so in Job 1, we're introduced to Job, a man who's wealthy, prosperous, large family, worships God. On the first chapter, in the first few verses, any one of us would love to be Job. He's the wealthiest man, most prosperous, many children, worships God. And not only that, but here in verse 8, we'll see in our passage, verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8, that God says about Job, can we have both verse front and back? Have you noticed my servant Job? What does God, literally God of the universe, call Job? He is the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Can you imagine? He is like the most quote unquote perfect human being without being perfect, right? Like he is the epitome of as blameless and righteous and good as you can get. Can you imagine what it's like to be complimented by God in this way? Like how good he was, truly. Okay, so when we complain about God, why do you allow bad things to happen to good people like me? No one was as good as Job. Okay, nobody. This is how good Job was. So now here we are. We don't understand what's happening behind the scenes. Now, as the reader, you know when you watch a show or read a book, and the narrator, the author, tells us, the reader, something the main character does not know. Okay? So Job, the main character, has no idea what's going on behind the scenes. But behind the scenes, we are privy to what's happening. And behind the scenes, spiritually, for some reason, there's this kind of like heavenly council happening. And Satan has the audacity to go up to God and speak to him. But God does engage with him. And that's how this begins. Okay? So Satan replies back in verse 9. He's like, well, yeah, he's good. But of course he fears you. You have always put a wall of protection around him, his home, his property. You've made him prosper. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Do you know who knows you better than anyone else besides God? Who knows human beings, human nature, and human heart better than anybody else except for God? The enemy of our souls, Satan. He understands the human working better than we do sometimes. And Satan knows you take away all the good and he will curse you. Because he's fickle. Man is fickle and conditional in his love. And so you take it away and he will not follow you anymore. He will not follow you anymore. Now, think about the ways that you have responded to God in suffering in your own life. What is the hardest thing that you ever had to go through? Some of you have had some very hard things happen in your life. Now think about that. And how have you responded? A lot of us probably like what Satan says, that when we suffer, we're angry with God and we curse him and we're mad at him. Or maybe we have responded like Job. But regardless, what happens is that God, for some reason, allows Satan, here in verse 12, he says, okay, then you can test him. Now, remember, God is sovereign. He knows all things. So therefore, he already knows how Job will react, right? Okay, don't forget that. He already knows how Job will respond. And so essentially, this is not against Job. This is against who? Satan. He's like, yo, okay, you got a point. Human beings are often like that. But God, in his foresight, in his sovereignty, God is literally in the past, in the present, and the future at the same time. He's outside of time. And so he already knew how Job would respond. He knew that Job would worship. And so he said, okay, you can test him. Take away everything. Don't touch his life. And so literally in the same day, he loses all of his money, all of his livelihood, all of his possessions, and all of his children in one day. In one day. Okay? Who's ever had a really bad day? Okay, but probably not as bad as Job, okay? Literally lost everything in a second. Some people actually have, right? Whether it's war or some natural disaster, right? You can lose everything in one day, literally. Some people can. That was Job. Everything in one day. Gone. Just like that. Now, there's a lot for us to balance here as finite human beings. Your brains are probably fried. Because you're like, how could God allow this? How could God allow this kind of suffering? But ultimately, through 42 chapters, Job, if you want some light bedtime reading, because you can't go to sleep, read the book of Job, okay? 42 chapters of Job wrestling with God of like, why? Why do you allow suffering? I know you're good. I know I didn't sin, so why? 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 42 chapters of that question. The biggest theme we can see is that God is sovereign. Ultimately, God is sovereign. Beyond our suffering, beyond understanding why, God is sovereign and in control of all things. Nothing happens that is not ultimately controlled by this full knowledge, full love, full wisdom, full power. God not only has a cosmic plan, but he has an individual plan for each and every one of you. And somehow he balances all of our individual plans with his giant cosmic plan and still pulls everything off. We could never do it, but God does. Now, one thing we do see from this book is that God does allow certain tests in our lives. He does. To ultimately train us spiritually and to know him truly and deeply. Now, remember, he lost what? His home, everything. His possessions, his flock, his money, his children, all in one day. And in verse 20, we see his response. Okay, he gets told, like, you lost everything, man. And in verse 20, Job stood up, tore his robe in grief. So in those days, how they showed their internal grief was to rip their clothes, shave their head, or put ashes on their head, and sit in mourning. That was how they externally showed their grief. So that's what he's doing right now. When he tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground, he's showing his grief externally. What I love about Job is that we see his grief and there's room for that. Right? There's room for his grief. Because we often just idolize like, oh, wow, he worshiped. Yes, and he grieved. Often in that middle space where both overlap like a Venn diagram, that's where our spiritual strengthening happens, right? In that Venn diagram space. Between there's space for your grief and there's also space to worship. And those two things often seem paradoxical. But the most paradoxical thing was Jesus dying, the Son of Man dying so that we could live. All of Christianity is built on the most giant paradox of all time. And everything God does often is paradoxical. In great grief, what was Job's response? He fell to the ground and worshiped. What did he say? Naked I came into the world, and naked I will leave. You guys, if you and I have that kind of perspective every day, we will probably spend less money on things that don't mean much to us. We'll probably spend more time with people that we care more about. We will live differently if we truly understand that literally, naked I came and naked I will leave. People say, well, I'm building a fortune for my future generations. They're going to squander it away, okay? Maybe. I mean, who knows? We have no idea. What do we build all this up for? One day, we will all die. I love Sam's. He says his favorite book in the Bible is Ecclesiastes. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Everything, vanity. All of it's meaningless. What's the point, you know? And so we have to live for something beyond just this material world, beyond this life. That there is something beyond this. Naked I will came in, naked I will leave. That song we sang earlier today, Blessed Be the Name, that's a very famous song. That song literally comes from the book of Job. Blessed be your name. That bridge we didn't sing, it says you give and take away. You give and, literally right here. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord takes it away. Blessed be your name on suffering, and hardship, and goodness, and all the seasons. Blessed be the name. Praise the name of God. In all this, Job did not sin by blaming God. Job is human. Of course he's going to grieve. And yet in his grief, he still worshiped. All of this did not blame God, which leads to our main point in the next line. Even in our suffering, God is worthy of worship. Can I hear amen? You're right, okay? Even in our suffering, God is worthy of worship. God is worthy of worship. Because God is worthy no matter what's happening in my life, no matter what's going on in our world, God is always worthy of worship. This is actually less about Job and it's more about God and his character, this book. Because Job is human, just like the rest of us. But how did he endure the suffering that he faced? By knowing God's character and knowing who he was. After years of following him, when literally Job's rock bottom happened, we see the foundation was built on not himself, on not his wealth, on not his children, not on his future, but on the very knowledge of God. That God is all-powerful, all-knowing, just, righteous. When you go and buy a house, what's the most important thing to look at? Foundation. Foundation is the most important thing to look at. You could have the prettiest house, all flipped, all redone, and if it's built on sinking sand, your house will not stand, right? Okay? The same thing for us. You can have the most beautiful looking life in Jesus, but if you have not built a foundation on knowing who God is, because everything will change. Your family, they might hate you one day. Okay, that's not great. But like family, friends, all the things will fade away. Your parents one day will die. You will one day die. All of us, everything can go away in an instant. The only thing that does not change is God and who he is, always and forever. The more we know God, the more we are compelled to worship in seasons of good and seasons of bad. So, over the next 40 chapters, we see there are 4 friends that come to console Job. And for 1 week, they sit there in silence, grieving. And that's the best thing those friends did, is to grieve alongside Job. But the minute they opened their mouths, they ruined everything. Okay, they ruined everything. And then 40 chapters goes by. Well, like 30 plus. Okay? And they start accusing Job. They're like, Job, do you want my advice? What's the answer to that? No. Let me give it to you anyway. Here's my advice. You know why you're suffering? It's because you sinned. That's why. It's a very black and white thinking. Like, which part of us, that makes sense as kids, right? Like, if you sinned, you did wrong, you're going to suffer the consequences. That is true, but they were very limited in their understanding of God, those friends. But they kept bugging him. They're like, dude, think about it. There's some kind of sin that you don't know or you're too proud to acknowledge. It's got to be something. Because why else would God strike you like this? 40 chapters of this. They're trying to wrestle with this age-old question. And Job is really frustrated because he's like, yo, man, I'm not perfect, but I swear I did not do something bad enough to deserve this, okay? This does not make sense. And he wrestled with God. He's like, God, I thought you were just. Why would you allow this? Maybe he knew he was one of the most righteous men in the world. I don't know. But he's struggling. He's like, why me? Why? You should have hit Elihu. Okay? He's my friend. I don't like him very much. But why did you hit me like this? Why did you hit me like this? He longed to question and understand God, which all of us human beings, that is our natural response. And notice that God allows that. This goes on for like 30 plus chapters. They're like going back and forth. Okay, how many of you have met someone who thinks they are really smart, but they start talking and maybe they are not as smart as they think, okay? Or like Sam, for example, he works in coding and someone's like, oh, I know coding, and they start talking and he's like, no, you don't. You don't know what you're talking about, okay? What does that make you look like? makes you look dumb, like you really don't actually know anything. That's kind of what's going on here. These people, God is just like, oh, you guys are cute. Look at you guys arguing about things you don't even understand. And so Job is like, God, why don't you answer me? And in chapter 38, God shows up in a whirlwind. In a huge whirlwind, God shows up. And notice, God does not actually answer the question. We, as the audience of the book, the readers, we know what happened. We know that it was Satan who was like, hey, if you touch him, he'll curse you. And God said, okay. We know that. And honestly, God could have very easily explained that to Job. And Job been like, oh, it was not me, it was Satan. But God does not actually tell him any of that. God does not answer why he allowed the suffering. But this is how God answers. He shows up in the world and he says, Job, were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? Were you there when I told the ocean to go this far and only this far? Were you there when I created the entire earth? Are you the one that sustains the entire cosmic apparatus? Do you understand any of it? Were you there? Did you do any of that? For several chapters, God goes on and says, do you understand that I am God and you are not? And though you can ask the questions and though you may wrestle with it, you will still never fully understand what only I can understand. And so this was Job's response in Job 42, verse 1-3. He says this, Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do anything and no one can stop you. God, you asked me, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? When you and I wrestle with God, I want you to read that verse. Who is this? Who are you that you question my wisdom with such ignorance? It is I. Job's like, it was me. I was the ignorant one. I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. I take back what I said. I sit in the dust and ashes to show my repentance. Ultimately, Job is humbled in the face of a great God, of a great, great God. Now, Job never actually finds out the real reason behind his suffering, even though we know it. And what that shows us is that ultimately, most of us, when we suffer, ask the question, why? But that why is actually meant to drive you to know God deeper. More than the answer itself, that why is meant to ask God and to know him deeper. Because even in our suffering, he's worthy of worship. And through suffering, we actually know him more. So let me ask you, what has been your response in your life to suffering? Now, it might not be some really obvious suffering, like you didn't lose your whole house and all your money and all your family in one day. Maybe you have. But regardless, maybe it's a different kind of suffering. But what is your response? When you face suffering, I invite you to ask these two questions. Ready? Number one, is God still worthy of worship? Even in my suffering, even if I get nothing, is God still worthy of worship? And what am I learning about God in the suffering? Because often those are the two things God is wanting us to know. Can I have the praise team go up? There is no greater way to learn about God than to actually go through some of the harder seasons of your life. Whether you have gone through hard things right now or you will go through hard things later, the reality of the world is everyone suffers to some degree. But as Christians, hope is a uniquely Christian experience. Because in hope, the hope that we have through Jesus, who was even greater than Job. Jesus was even more perfect than Job because he was truly perfect as Son of God made human and flesh. And yet even Jesus suffered so that we could have life. Can we all stand? There is no easy answer to why. And as Christians, I encourage us that we can sit in grief and we can sit in worship at the same time. When I worship God and I say, worthy are you, God, that does not cancel all the suffering I faced. It does not cancel all the grief that I wrestle with. But in my grief, I worship him and say, God, you are worthy. You are worthy. You are worthy. And so let's sing this song together to declare that he is worthy.